Hello everyone, welcome to the second part of Lecture 8, which is about management and communication. As I record this, I've got a bit of a cold, so please excuse if my voice sounds a bit blocked up. Okay, let's start. Now, the practice of communication covers a wide range of activities and different methods of communication in organisations. And this makes producing a single definition that captures all of these different manifestations rather difficult. So, for example, we might consider communication as simply the exchange of information or the transmission of meaning. But we also need to recognise that communication usually takes place for a particular reason. For example, it's often intended that the transmission of a message will lead to some change in the receiver. This change might be behavioural. In other words, the communication is expected to lead to some form of action. But in other cases, it might simply be desired to increase the level of knowledge that the receiver possesses. And we still need to consider what this process of information and information exchange involves, and the various factors involved in transmission. And these are many and varied, as we'll see. We must also appreciate that an exchange of information requires the interpretation of symbols. So, for example, words are simply symbols that represent meaning. It also must be recognised that meaning does not solely reside in the words themselves. It derives from a process of interpretation in which other factors like body language have an influence. Interpretation is rarely consistent or stable and can be influenced by many factors. Different people may, for many different reasons, interpret the same message in different ways. As we will explore in this lecture, there are different forms of communication using different media, and therefore many different types of symbols which must be interpreted. We'll discuss how the way messages are transmitted and the medium that is used affects the way they are received and interpreted. We'll recognise how the process of communication involves both the sender and the receiver, and this means the communication often forms a cycle in which feedback is given by the receiver to the sender. We'll also consider how the wider cultural context influences the process of communication. But let's begin by noting the centrality of communication to the practice of management. Now, communication is central to management, and most studies find that managers spend as much as 80% of their time in communication of one sort or another for different purposes. And effective communication is particularly important in situations marked by uncertainty and complexity, and these situations may require distinct and careful communication techniques which give particular attention to the content of the message, the process of communication, and the ways in which it might be interpreted. This encourages us to appreciate that the context in which messages are produced is very important, and this context will affect all aspects of the communication process. And as we'll see, certain contexts will make specific demands on communication methods and affect how we utilise them. There are also many barriers to successful communication in organisations, and research suggests that much organisation communication is misunderstood or ignored for numerous reasons, and these are both individual and structural. Furthermore, it cannot be assumed that the differences and agreements that we find in organisations are simply a result of deficient communication. We must appreciate that organisations consist of many different interests, and these interests may be the root cause of these problems. Communication difficulties in these cases are only symptomatic of deeper differences within the organisation. Now, technology is also an important influence on communication. And technology has always affected the way in which we communicate and presents and provokes behavioural changes as a consequence. But in management and in wider society, the means and modes of communication that we use have changed dramatically in recent decades. The telephone, then the internet, and most recently personal communication devices like smartphones have influenced how, when and why people communicate. And these trends have both benefits and disadvantages. Positively, we have many more opportunities to communicate rapidly without delays or filters, and we can incorporate rich content such as photos, videos and links to other information in our exchanges. Consider how your behaviour would be affected if you didn't have a mobile phone. To give one trivial example, how would you let a friend know that you would be late for meeting them? Now, many are concerned that these devices are actually rendering our communication less meaningful and actually less personal. For example, in the online unit, you'll read of the consequences of email proliferation and how this can often be detrimental to effective communication in organisations. Many also argue that online media can distort or diminish communication. For example, web pages draw us into a myriad of embedded links, and we're assaulted by other messages via pop-up, Twitter and Facebook links. And this is an environment, some people argue, that promotes cursory reading and hurried and distracted thinking, and as a consequence, perhaps rather superficial learning. So in this respect, having greater access to information is not the same as acquiring learning and wisdom. But despite and perhaps because of these developments, communication, both verbal and non-verbal, remains an important dimension of management, and one which has severe consequences if done badly. So later in this lecture, we'll examine different communication styles, consider how communication is processed and interpreted, and how culture and language influences communication and miscommunication. Let's begin with examining the different purposes and modes of communication in organisations. Now, communication has different major functions within an organisation. Let's look at some key ones. Firstly, communication controls behaviour. All organisations have formal systems, rules and regulations that employees are expected to follow. But simply that they are in existence is not in itself adequate. They will not be understood or complied with unless they are clearly communicated to employees, particularly those who are new. Informal forms of communication can also exert control. For instance, in an informal work group, output might be regulated by communication between work members. A member who is working too fast may receive a reminder of what is acceptable. Communication is also central to motivation. Communication is necessary to outline what is expected of employees to feedback on performance, and to explain how performance might be improved. Communication is therefore central to setting goals and reinforcing desired behaviour. Communication also allows emotions to be expressed, and the social aspect of work is extremely important in organisations. Through communication, social relationships are created, maintained and enhanced. These are not only central to a pleasant working environment, they also are necessary for effective work. Desirable conditions like high motivation are strongly influenced by these social factors. And finally, communication facilitates decision making by providing the necessary information on which decisions can be based. Communication therefore has a vital informative role by providing the necessary data on which decisions can be made. Information is not simply provided purely for its own sake, but it's required to facilitate action. Now, in practice, most communication activities will combine some or all of these functions and occur in all aspects of organisational life. For example, these might include directing action and achieving coordination. So managers need to communicate to their staff what is expected of them. They need to be able to bring together the activities of large numbers of people in order that they achieve organisational objectives. Communication is central to job training. Employees need to know how to do the jobs and why they need to be done in a particular way. Communication establishes rules and regulations. These need to be communicated clearly to staff and include things like timekeeping, safety codes, and disciplinary and grievance policies. Communication is used to disseminate new information. This is necessary to keep everyone up to date, especially when changes are planned. Communication tells people about the organisational mission and the wider goals. Employees need to know what collectively they are aiming at and what the overall mission of the organisation is. Communication is central to performance management. Good communication is required to appraise employee performance, to give feedback to staff on how well they are doing, and offering corrective measures where necessary. As we mentioned previously, communication motivates, or good communication motivates. Employees need encouragement and support, and sometimes counselling. Communication encourages involvement and commitment. It's there to gather staff's opinion, build up trust and loyalty, and develop a sense of an association with the wider organisation. Now, knowing that we must communicate and have something to communicate, and when we must do it, does not in itself guarantee effective communication. As we'll see, the different objectives of communication, the different activities in which we communicate, will influence which methods of communication are the most effective for particular purposes. What then are the characteristics of effective communication? How can we tell when it's been effective? So firstly, effective communication is accurate. The message clearly reflects the intention of the sender and is received this way as intended. Secondly, it's reliable. This means that the different people receiving the message at different times would interpret it the same way. Thirdly, it's valid. This means that the message allows us to recognise and understand events based on the knowledge that it conveys. And fourthly, the message contains adequate information and is timed appropriately. If these characteristics are present and achieved, it's likely the communication will be effective. In other words, it will achieve the sender's intentions. There are several different principles that underpin achieving these outcomes. Firstly, completeness. This principle relates to the receiver's needs. A message is complete when it conveys what the receiver needs to know. Sometimes this may require the sender giving more information than they originally intended, and this depends on the situation and the needs of the receiver. The sender must be flexible and receptive to the possible responses of the receiver. Secondly, conciseness and clarity. A message is concise when it contains only relevant statements and eliminates redundancy. This might be irrelevant or superfluous information. In verbal and written communication, it might involve eliminating wordy constructions and unnecessary rhetorical flourishes. Sentences should be clear and avoid the use of jargon, and be carefully constructed without unnecessary clauses. Concise messages will have a clear subject and purpose, and the information provided will be relevant to this purpose. Ideas will be presented in a logical way and supported by necessary evidence. Thirdly, consideration and courtesy. This is about recognizing the needs of the receiver. Messages should be shaped in a way that recognizes these. For example, a receiver may be more inclined to receive a message positively if it's designed to offer help and assistance, rather than focusing on correcting mistakes. It also suggests recognizing the individual characteristics of the receiver. For example, is the language of communication the receiver's first language? Consideration is also required in deciding how the message is organized and whether, for example, an indirect or direct approach is taken. In the direct approach, the main ideas are put first and evidence follows. With the indirect approach, the reverse is true. So the direct approach may be more appropriate where receivers are likely to be happy with the content of the message. Otherwise, an indirect approach may be more appropriate as it allows the receivers to be persuaded by the evidence. And cultural preferences are important here, and we'll return to these later in the lecture. Finally, concreteness. Concreteness depends on the use of necessary evidence, so messages are clearly supported and avoid uncertainty. In some cases, messages require diplomacy and might benefit from a degree of vagueness to allow flexible interpretations. But usually, the intentions of the sender needs to be made clear, and these intentions and assertions be clearly justified. Now you can consider how these different principles might affect the choice of medium for a message, and how they might recognize the purpose and needs of recipients. To be effective communicators, managers need to select an appropriate communication medium for each message they send. For example, should a change in rules and regulations be communicated to subordinates in a memo sent through email? Should a message of congratulation about a major accomplishment be communicated in a letter, a phone call, or personally face-to-face? Should a redundancy announcement be made through a memo or at a a general meeting, a collective general meeting? Should a member of a purchasing team travel to the Middle East to formalise a new deal with a new supplier? Or can they do this through video conference? There's no best communication medium for managers to rely on that will apply in all circumstances. It's necessary to consider the requirements of the situation and select accordingly, recognising the strengths and weaknesses of the approach and the consequences for the communication process. But in choosing a communication medium, managers might consider three factors. The first and most important is the level of information richness that is needed. Information richness is the amount of information a communication medium can carry and the extent to which the medium enables the sender and receiver to reach a common understanding. Media high in information richness can carry an extensive amount of information and generally should enable receivers and senders to come to a common understanding. The second factor that managers need to consider in selecting a communication medium is the time needed for communication. And here we can make the distinction between synchronous and asynchronous communication. A telephone conversation is an example of synchronous communication. An email is an example of asynchronous communication. And clearly, synchronous communication has the benefit of facilitating instant feedback. The third factor that affects the choice of communication medium is the need of some trail, either paper or electronic, some kind of documentation that a message was sent and received. So physical evidence is often required. So for example, a manager may wish to document in writing that a subordinate was given a formal warning about excessive lateness. Now we mentioned information richness, and the different communication media that managers can use vary in their information richness, as shown in the table on the slide. So you may want to think about different communication scenarios and consider how their needs, their particular needs, influence what methods should be used to achieve effective communication in these circumstances. So consider the following types of media and the suggested circumstances where the method might be most appropriate, and then come up with your own example. So for face-to-face communication, an example could be where appraisal, where feedback and interaction is crucial to the process. But it's also you also should recognise in these situations that a formal written record will also be needed. Email. Email can be used in different ways, personally and impersonally. And it offers a record of the communication. Impersonal emails might be used to communicate instructions or inform large groups of staff. But the proliferation of emails presents dangers to effective communication, and poor email etiquette can affect how personal emails are interpreted. Telephone. So like face-to-face communication, it offers a relatively fast form of communication which is personal and offers immediate feedback. And it might be used for more informal messages than face-to-face communication, where practicality like geographical separation and the need for immediacy requires it. Of course, we've also got related technologies now based on video conferencing that adds a richness to this form of communication. And the last example would be a formal physical document. So these tend to be used where formal agreement needs to be evidenced, perhaps for legal reasons. And this could be in the context of a contract offer or a supplier agreement. and they're often necessary to supplement and record other forms of communication, for example, something that's occurred face to face. Previous example we gave was the appraisal situation. Let's look in more detail now at a particularly important but often neglected form of communication, and that's non-verbal communication. Now, verbal communication consists of words, numbers, diagrams and pictures. And it's perhaps what we normally think about when we consider communication. But we also communicate non-verbally, and it's worthwhile considering the implications of this significant and influential form of communication. It's notable because we're often not aware of its effects, and we can communicate unintentionally using these methods, these behaviours. Non-verbal communication consists of postures and gestures, and this is usually what we call body language. But it also captures noises like grunts, and these are described by the term paralinguistics. These are forms of communication that are often unconscious. It's usually impossible to avoid sending non-verbal messages. For example, even if we simply do not respond to a message, then it will be interpreted in some way, perhaps as representing disapproval. The other party will inevitably wonder why we haven't replied. So you consider here the implications for behaviour of read messages. The things we find on email and messaging apps when we can see whether someone has read our message, but perhaps then hasn't replied. It's often said that non-verbal communication sets the context for verbal communication, and this is the idea that actions speak louder than words. In other words, the non-verbal message may override the verbal one, particularly when they are felt to be in contradiction. So let's look in more detail at different types of non-verbal communication. One of the most significant forms of non-verbal communication is eye contact. And we're very aware of where someone is looking, and we draw inferences from this behaviour. So avoidance of gaze sends the message that the person does not want contact. But again, the context is important. For example, avoiding gaze might be a useful and accepted social behaviour in a crowded situation, such as a lift, an elevator. In general, though, we expect some form of eye contact in communication, and we interpret it carefully. For example, purposefully looking down while listening signals deference. A cycle of fleeting eye contact and looking sideways tends to suggest guilt and shiftiness. Prolonged looking at someone's eyes can indicate confrontation or attraction, depending on the context. We also need to recognise that many of these interpretations are culturally influenced. So in some cultures, it's considered polite to look away when a superior is speaking, but others might interpret this as shiftiness or insolence. There are many other forms of facial expression, and these can sometimes betray our true feelings. Interpretations of these include raised eyebrows signal amazement or disbelief. Narrow eyes and pursed lips signal anger. Frowns signal unhappiness or hostility. Biting or trembling lips signal anxiety and worry. Smiling signals friendliness, pleasure, but perhaps a desire to please. Gestures of limbs and fingers often indicate underlying emotional states too. So let's look at some examples. Head movements, movements of the head, are particularly important. Nodding, of course, means, in most cases, a person is paying attention and agrees, where shaking of the head signals strong disagreement. Shrugging shows indifference. Fidgeting, particularly with fingers touching hair and face, shifting from foot to foot, indicates nervousness. Now, to some extent, these forms of body language can be brought under control and used to exert desired influence. And we often see this with political figures who have undergone media training. Posture is another important non-verbal cue. So, sitting upright on the edge of a chair and leaning slightly forward indicates active listening and interest. Sitting with legs slightly apart and arms slightly bent down one side indicates openness. Hands on hips signals anger. Folded arms indicate a determined unresponsiveness. A person's voice also gives information. This is the way we speak rather than what we say. A strong, clear, low voice without hesitation signals confidence and certainty. A high-pitched, shaky voice indicates nervousness. Broken, hesitant speech sends the message that the speaker is unsure of themselves and is unprepared. The physical setting, this is sometimes called proxemics, the physical setting in which communication takes place, also sends strong non-verbal signals too. For example, a meeting with a superior in an office where he or she is seated behind a desk will be shorter and more formal, and will tend to make the subordinate try to justify their own achievements than if the meeting took place in a cafe or a more informal setting. The layout of an office, for example, whether it's open plan or individual, made up of individual offices, will also send a message about an organisation's culture. And the physical distance across which dialogue occurs also has implications. And there are cultural differences here, as in all types of non-verbal communication preference. In Anglo-Saxon countries, distances greater than 2 meters will communicate an impersonal, remote relationship, whereas a distance of 1 meter will indicate a working business relationship. A distance less than a half of a meter will indicate an intimate emotional relationship of some kind. And these distances will be different, interpreted different in different cultures. And we'll look at some important cultural influences on communication a little later in the lecture. So, having looked at the purposes and types of communication, let's look at some reasons why communication often fails to achieve its objectives. Getting accurate information to the right people at the right time is more difficult than it sounds, and it's probably the case that you have many examples yourself of poor communication and its consequences. There are many reasons why communication fails, and in many cases the problems are more fundamental than the communication process itself. Sometimes the complexity of the issues involved means that it's difficult to know when it's the right time to communicate and what people actually need to know and want to know. Information is rarely neutral in organisations, and it's produced, received and interpreted by people who have different interests and opinions. And since communication is a social process, then social and cultural differences also intervene and affect the process of interpretation and understanding. All these factors mean that there are many different ways in which communication can be affected by unintended and unpredictable consequences. So let's look at some of these barriers to communication. Most examples of communication will have to contend with some or all of them. Firstly, power differences. Research shows that hierarchies distort communication, and many superiors often have a limited understanding of subordinate needs, experiences and problems. It may be felt that if there's a significant power difference between the parties to communication, that the discussion is not genuine and it's conducted from the point of view of a particular vested interest. So the superior may think that the subordinate is putting on a show to be seen in a good light, and this can lead to filtering or selective perception. So filtering is where the sender manipulates information so they might be perceived more favourably by the receiver. A subordinate might try to tell their superior what he or she wants to hear because they think this will benefit them in some way. Filtering is influenced clearly by power differences, and it's more likely to be found in organisations where status differences are significant. And this means that communication will tend to filter out bad news that the sender thinks the receiver would be displeased to hear. Selective perception is a process similar to filtering, but it's performed by the receiver. And in this situation, the receiver only hears what he or she wants to hear. Communication is therefore interpreted based on the needs, motivation and other characteristics of the receiver rather than what the message objectively contains. Information scarcity. Now, information in an organisation is often a scarce resource. There's rarely perfect information, and this scarcity not only affects the accuracy of information, but it also means that information becomes an important basis of power and influence. For example, it might motivate people to withhold information in order to strengthen their position. And to use a well-known expression, information is power. Information overload. Most of us can only process a limited amount of information. And when the information that we receive exceeds our processing capacity, we experience information overload. And in these situations, we have more information than we can usefully process. We're unable to recognise what is useful and what isn't. And in contemporary organisations, this is often found with electronic communication, like emails, which have a tendency to proliferate. The sheer volume of emails we receive means that it's impossible to distinguish those that are important and those that are irrelevant. And as a consequence, we might actually ignore something that is important. Let's look at another group of common barriers to communication. The first is gatekeepers. And gatekeepers control access to information. And they're occupied in positions of strategic importance in communication channels. And this means that they're able to both grant and prevent access to information for other people. And these positions may be separate to the conventional organisational hierarchy. So, for example, a secretary may be an important gatekeeper, even though his or her organisational position is not formally powerful. Partiality. Information is rarely impartial, and it reflects instead individuals' interests and resources. And information, as we've seen, is often scarce. And this scarcity means that any gaps in knowledge tend to be filled in by assumptions. Less than perfect knowledge means that the same situation can be interpreted in different ways according to the information that's available to different parties and the assumptions they use to fill in the gaps. Physical surroundings. And this includes factors like the structure of buildings and rooms, the accessibility of technology, and our capacity to use it. All of these have characteristics that can influence the process of communication. Language. Irrespective of national differences, even within one country, there's variance in accent and dialects, and these can affect communication. Words mean different things to different people. Age, educational background, and cultural difference all affect the meaning we give to words and the words we use. Words can also change their meaning over time and in different contexts. And organisations also have their own jargon or technical language, and this often creates a barrier to effective communication. Subcultures or sub-functions within organisations will often have their own language, which is difficult for other groups to comprehend. Stereotyping. Now, stereotyping occurs when we assume that the other party, the other person, has certain characteristics based on the group to which they belong, without us first checking whether or not they actually do have these characteristics. And we may adapt or suppress information because we are making assumptions about these assumed characteristics. For example, we may talk in a particular way to an old person based on our assumption of age, and this may be irritating to the person that we're talking to. And lastly, and relatedly, cultural diversity. Different cultures have different norms of expectations concerning communication, and lack of awareness of these cultural differences can create misunderstanding, and we'll concentrate on these issues for the next part of the lecture. So a key distinction here is between high and low context cultures. And we can use this to try to understand some of the different tendencies between cultural groups. Now, we need to be cautious about stereotyping in making these assessments. But drawing on these categories, we can identify countries like China, Japan, and Korea as high context cultures. And here, people take an interest in symbols of position and relationship. High context cultures value personal relationships and goodwill, and tend to make agreements based on trust and negotiate slowly. Places like North America, Scandinavia, and Germany are low context cultures. And here people are more preoccupied with written rules and agreements, and often require documentation to support these agreements. And these preferences are reflected in business practice. Low context cultures value expertise and performance and prefer agreements based on legal contracts. They negotiate fast and efficiently to reach this point of agreement. And these preferences influence communication practice and what people expect and consider significant. So high context cultures, the people in these cultures tend to heavily rely on a range of social and non-verbal cues when communicating with each other. So in such societies such as Japan and many Arab countries, messages are often highly coded and implicit. And as a result, the receiver's job is to interpret what the message means by correctly considering what is being said and the way in which it's being conveyed. This approach is in contrast to low context societies such as the United States and Canada, where messages tend to be explicit and the speaker tends to say, or try to say, precisely what he or she means. Low context cultures often favour the written rather than spoken word in formal communication. So consequently, these contextual factors must be considered when messages are being developed in different societies or in intercultural communication. So let's look in more detail at how cultural difference affects communication styles. So cultural influences are associated with particular styles of communication, and we can look at some of these differences. Firstly, indirect versus direct styles. So in high context cultures, messages tend to be implicit and indirect. One reason is that those are communicating, so family, friends, co-workers, clients, tend to have close personal relationships and high and large information networks. As a result, each knows a lot about the other people in the communication network. One consequence is that they don't have to rely on language alone to communicate, so voice intonation, timing, facial expressions all play a role in conveying information. In organisations, in business contexts, in low context cultures, people will tend to meet only to accomplish objectives. And since they don't necessarily know each other well personally, they tend to be direct and focused in their communications. A good way of comparing these two kinds of culture, high context and low context, is to find out what types of questions are typically asked when someone is contacted and told to attend a meeting. In a high context culture, it's common for someone to ask, who will be at this meeting, so he or she knows how to prepare for appropriate personal interactions. In contrast, in a low context culture, the individual is likely to ask, what is the meeting going to be about? And so this is because he or she then knows how to properly organise and prepare for the nature of the engagement and what it demands. In other words, in the high context society, the person focuses on the environment in which the meeting will take place. In the low context society, the individual is most interested in the objectives that are to be accomplished at the meeting. Next, elaborate versus succinct styles. And this indicates the quantity of communication. And we can identify three levels: elaborate, exacting, and succinct. In high context societies, the elaborate style is often very common. There's a great deal of talking, descriptions include much detail, and people will tend to repeat themselves. And this style is associated by many theorists with some Arabic countries. The exacting style is more common in nations such as the United Kingdom, Germany and Sweden. And this style focuses on precision and the use of just the right amount of words to convey the message. If a person uses too many words, it's considered exaggeration, and if they use too few, then the consequence is an ambiguous message. The succinct style is said to be common in many Asian countries, and this is where people tend to say few words and allow understatements, pauses and silence also to convey meaning. In unfamiliar situations, communicators are succinct in order to avoid risking a loss of face or some form of social embarrassment. And now contextual versus personal styles. A contextual style is one that's heavily influenced by the position and relationships of the parties involved in communication. So in some Asian cultures, it's said that people use words that reflect the role and hierarchical relationship of those in the conversation. So as a result, in an organisational setting, people will use words that indicate their status relative to the status of the other person, the other party. And the failure to use proper language is socially embarrassing. For example, the correct form of Japanese to use with someone else depends not only on the relationship between the two people, but also the relationship between their reference groups. So while juniors defer to seniors in Japan, this relationship is complicated if the junior person works for a more prestigious organisation than the senior. And as a consequence, it's likely that both parties will use a very polite, neutral form of communication to avoid any possibility of social embarrassment. A more personal style strives to reduce the barriers between parties. And in the United States, for example, it's common to use first names and to address others informally and to treat each other on an equal basis, irrespective of the formal position of each other. And these formal positions are there, and they may be present under the surface and will probably appear when circumstances require it. But in most situations, an informal approach will be dominant. Now, researchers have found that the contextual style is often associated with collective high context cultures, examples like I've said, Japan, India and Ghana. And the personal style is more popularly found in low power distance, low context cultures like the United States, Australia and Canada. And you'll learn more about these cultural differences, classifications and their implications in the International People Management Unit coming a little later. Finally, the affective style. This style is characterized by language that requires the listener to carefully note what is being said and to observe how the sender presents the message. Quite often, intentions that are being conveyed non-verbally requires the receiver to use his or her intuitive skills to decipher what's being said. And the part of the message that's being left out is as important as what's being included, as what's being said. Now, the affective style is contrasted with the instrumental style. The instrumental style is goal-orientated and focuses on the sender. The individual clearly sets out to let the other party know what he or she wants them to know. And the affective style, as you probably guessed, is found in collective high context cultures. The instrumental style is found in more individualistic low context cultures. Now, these cultural preferences clearly create challenges, particularly when communication is carried out across cultures. People doing business in a foreign culture often misinterpret the meaning of messages and arrive consequently at erroneous conclusions. Consider a case of a Canadian doing business in a Middle East country. This Canadian was surprised when his meeting with a high-ranking official was not held in a closed office and was constantly interrupted. Now, following their cultural assumptions, that firstly, important people have large private offices with secretaries to monitor the flow of people into the office, and secondly, that important business takes precedence over less important business and therefore it's important not to be interrupted. The Canadian interpreted the open office and interruptions to mean that the official was neither as high-ranking nor as interested in conducting the proposed business as he'd previously thought. But these conclusions derived from assumptions that were culturally specific, and in this case, erroneous, wrong. So how might this situation have been interpreted differently? What should the Canadian have done to check their assumption? You might like to think of situations where you've experienced such cultural dissonance and how your assumptions have affected your behaviour. Now, given these challenges, how can we improve communication effectiveness in an international context? Now, there are different steps that we can take to improve our effectiveness when we communicate across cultures, and let's just briefly look at some of these. Firstly, it's important to acknowledge differences and to develop and improve intercultural sensitivity. In a later unit, we'll talk about globalization, some idea that the world and its cultural aspects are converging, and there are similar economic and cultural preferences. We'll also see that there's considerable debate about the extent of these movements and their consequences. Now, whatever the extent of this process, it's clear that cultural preferences do differ between different groups of people. It's also clear that these differences will continue to influence effective communication. It's important that we recognise that these differences exist and to consider carefully their implications and importance. These differences are more than behavioural preferences. They reflect deeper beliefs. For example, the type of food that people consume is an expression of cultural identity. Similarly, the customs associated with gift exchanges, the exchange of gifts, involves symbolism, obligation, and reciprocity. And these differ between cultures. Cultures differ to the extent to which they value the individual or the group and how they perceive time. They differ how they respond to authority, how they treat personal space, and how they show emotion in situations of conflict. We'll look at these differences in more detail in the unit on international people management. But employees who accept their differences and adapt their behaviour to suit and recognise the styles of other cultures tend to get better results. Recognising this takes us only so far. We also need to improve our behaviour, so we can undertake cultural training. It's very difficult to communicate effectively with someone from another culture unless at least one party has some understanding of the culture of the other. Without some level of communication, understanding, and cultural understanding, communication is likely to break down. And this is particularly important for any kind of company that has multinational relationships. Despite the rhetoric of globalization, it's a mistake to generalize about an international business culture, because the different nations and regions of the world are still very different. And this means that training can be conducted on a regional or country-specific basis. Failure to do so, failure to recognise these important differences and to prepare for them, can result in frequent communication breakdowns. But as we'll see in the later unit, the International People Management Unit, there are cultural clusters which indicate commonalities in practice between the countries within these clusters. So, for example, firms that operate in South America sometimes find that the cultures of these countries have certain commonalities. And these common factors also apply to countries like Spain and Portugal. So consequently, a basic understanding of Latin cultures can prove to be useful throughout a large region of the world. And the same is true of Anglo cultures. And this is where, within these Anglo cultures, the norms and values tend to be somewhat similar from one country to another in this cultural cluster. But it's important that you should not interpret commonalities as signalling that the cultures are identical. Significant differences remain between these country clusters, and failure to recognise or appreciate the possibility of such differences can produce significant problems. All this means focusing on behaviour, listening carefully to what people say and watching what they do, and not extrapolating from initial impressions or previous experience to make assumptions about attitudes and intentions. Prejudice and stereotyping are dangerous temptations which we should guard against. We can work on our listening skills. Sometimes, especially if someone doesn't speak as clearly as you would like, does not communicate as clearly as you would like, there can be a temptation to get frustrated and perhaps subconsciously stop listening, perhaps to cut them off, or to simply, or to try and kind of fill in the gaps. In contrast, the so-called active listener maintains good contact with their communication partner. They don't interrupt, but they politely ask for clarification when something does not make sense. People tend to prefer to repeat themselves rather than be misunderstood, so the active listener is not afraid to ask questions. And if, after the communication process, there are aspects that retrospectively you are unsure about, then it's good practice to follow up in writing or ask someone to help on your behalf. In general, feedback is central to effective communication. And the last piece of advice is to avoid exclusionary language. We need to recognise that language, particularly informal language, is often very culturally specific. Conversation with colleagues that's reliant on our shared backgrounds, interests and common knowledge will exclude others who are not members of this network. And these differences are not only cultural, but they derive from gender, age and social class. Don't assume that the other parties in your communication network have the same reference points as you, and modify your language and references accordingly. Okay, let's conclude this lecture with recapping on some key points. In the most basic terms, effective communication occurs where the sender's message is accurately received and has the intended effect on the receiver. And this effect is often communicated back to the sender via some sort of feedback. But although we might identify principles of effective communication and acknowledge the importance of consistency between the method used to communicate and its objectives, we must recognise that there are many barriers to successful communication. There are individual, cultural and social factors that affect the shaping and interpretation of messages. The political realities of organisations can also intervene and lead to many unintended consequences. Communication is rarely a straightforward process of conveying rational information. Communication reflects personal and group interests, as well as simply being the means of facilitating organisational goals and objectives. Acknowledging these realities in developing effective communication requires an appreciation of the context in which communication takes place. Lastly and importantly, Organisational problems are often attributed to difficulties in communication. But we need to be careful because this is a rather naive view. If we recognise that communication occurs within a complex organisational reality, which is made up of different interests and cultures, then we also must recognise that communication difficulties are often the symptom rather than the causes of the problem. And in such cases, better communication should not be seen as a panacea, an easy solution, but they can lead to a greater and more realistic knowledge of the situation that we face. Okay, thank you.